So really excited to introduce Dr. Jeffery Martin to this group. Jeffrey's been a really close friend and collaborator of mine for a long time. Actually, when about maybe 4 years ago or 3 years ago, when I sort of decided and started to conceptualize what I wanted to do, that I wanted to work at this intersection of technology and human well-being. But even more specifically, I wanted to look at what is really the sort of pinnacle of human well-being, looking to, for example, some Eastern traditions and trying to understand when you meditate for 20 or 30,000 hours, what actually changes? What is that shift in experience that's possible? And can that be understood in a scientific context? And can we build technology to help facilitate those really profound and meaningful shifts in human consciousness? And I started looking around for that, and really there was no one working on that at all. It was basically impossible to find any kind of graduate work or mentors or anything. And I was very lucky to find a couple of people, including Jeffrey Martin, who's in Hong Kong at the time as a visiting professor at Hong Kong Polytech. He had actually completed his PhD here at CIIS and had done some graduate work at Harvard as well. And his work focused on bringing a scientific understanding to something that had really been out in a space of spirituality and religion for the last few thousand years. And there has already been a shift in a scientific understanding of meditation, and that's become fairly commonplace and something that we can talk about, and it's no longer taboo in academia to speak of, but it's still fairly taboo to talk about why does meditation exist? Why was it sort of invented in the first place, if you sort of think of it as a human invention, which it is. And so Jeffrey has really been looking at that and very much been a pioneer in that space, but not just looking at that from a scientific perspective, but really thinking deeply about the technologies that we can build to help make that more accessible. So we're really lucky to be benefiting here from the last 8 years of Jeffrey's research in a space that very few people are really looking at in a deep and meaningful way. So thank you, Jeffrey Martin.
The microphone. I was sitting in the back and it was a little hard to hear. So I can only imagine maybe what it might be like over there. So I think I'm going to go ahead and use the mic. First of all, I want to thank you all for coming. There's a tremendous number of familiar faces in the crowd across all of these different pockets in my life. It's really quite fascinating. Nick Temple in the front here has helped with technology projects for me for years. Probably over a decade at this point, all the way up to more recently Sperry Andrews, who just participated and helped with an experiment that we did earlier this year to see if we could actually induce persistent non-symbolic experience using traditional methods. So really nice to be here with you today. I'm going to try to find a sweet spot where the most people can see me without a pole and without me standing in front of the projector. It's really interesting if you think about this topic of persistent non-symbolic consciousness. As Mikey said, essentially this is very taboo in the academy. I'm actually in a process of really kind of phasing out of the work that we've done in the academy. And the reason for that is very simple. I really feel like there's been a strong groundswell and sort of more permission to conduct this kind of research within the academic world itself. So for instance, there's a guy named Dave Vago who actually put the word enlightenment in a pretty major peer-reviewed article subject not long ago. And that to me was a bellwether day, basically, when you could actually mention that and discuss it openly in the literature and get it past a major peer review process and all of that. So I really feel like over the last 8 years we've done a tremendous amount to try to build that groundswell, and that it's not as necessary for me to be involved in that. And so I'm starting to transition over more to really translate what we've learned and try to ask what we can do with that from a technological and even, I would say, an ordinary methods type of thing in the public space. So spending more time with people like Deepak Chopra and things like that than I have in previous years, trying to really sort of conceptualize that. And this meetup, this whole meetup thing, along with a number of other initiatives with Mikey, are really a key part of that. So I want to thank you all for your interest, really, and for coming out. One of the things that Mikey and I talk a lot about is that there hasn't been an overview of the technologies in this space. This is going to be a little bit of a combination. It's going to be a little bit of persistent non-symbolic experience, and also a little bit of trying to give you all an overall feel for the different types of technologies that can be used. So I'm going to try to sort of kill two birds with one stone while I'm here today, because I'm not often in San Francisco. Ordinarily, I'm just like traveling somewhere in the world on any given day. All right, so the thing is, most people are really looking for something to complete themselves. If you ask yourself, do you have goals? Chances are you do. And if you look at those goals, you'll probably notice that there are things that you're trying to add to yourself in some way. There are things that you're trying to say, well, if I only had that, I would be happy. Or if I only had that, I would have X, right? The interesting thing about the population of people that we've researched for the last 8 years is that essentially they feel complete. They don't really feel a need to add anything to themselves. They're not asking themselves, what can I do to be happy? Or what can I add to myself that will get me more approval from other people? So it's really a fundamental shift. It's a very different place to come from as a person. And it's an amazing place to come from as a person. I think evolution has done us, tremendous favors up to this point with sort of the standard consciousness that we've been operating from. But there's a transition that we can make to one that involves a much higher degree of well-being. And one of the things that goes along with that is that sense of feeling complete. I think when most people think about persistent non-symbolic experience and they associate it with words like religious words, spiritual words like enlightenment and non-duality and persistent mystical states, things along those lines, they think about these types of people, right? They think about Buddha or Saint Francis, or maybe if they're fans of Oprah, they've heard of Eckhart Tolle, and they've read some of his books or something, a little bit more contemporary there, right? But actually, our participant database is primarily comprised of ordinary people. And I can tell you that there are people sitting among you in the crowd right now that are in this population. If you look around, literally just take a moment and look around, can you pick them out? Right? Nobody's wearing monk's robes, so, you're a little bit disadvantaged. They're dressed like you. Right? They really look just like everybody else, right? It's kind of incredible. But there's, I know of at least probably 5 or 6 in this room that are there. Yeah, I bet you can't pick them out from the rest of the room, and that's kind of amazing. So if you look at our sample, it basically goes across the entire population. Our IRB, in the academic world, you have to have sort of a review board's approval. That starts at age 18 for us. It's not that people don't report this at younger ages. It's just that sort of the rules for us in conducting research at various institutions around the world dictated that we have sort of this floor around age 18. So it does go all the way down. I think the earliest I heard it reported was around age 4. But there are also people who report never being any different. Right? So a very, very, very tiny percentage of the population has basically been this way their entire life. They've never had what the rest of the world would really consider a normal human conscious experience. You can see it basically goes across all socioeconomic status, all religions, including atheists and agnostics. So this idea that, it's the Buddha and Saint Francis and Eckhart Tolle or whoever that are talking about this from a religious standpoint, there's all kinds of atheists and agnostics that report this. Just a little bit about our approach. I'm not going to talk too much about this aspect of the research because I really want to talk about technology and technological interfaces and stuff like that today. But essentially, we started with gold standard measures in psychology. So these are the things that maybe you've just filled them out online because you were curious about finding out how happy you were, or whatever, some aspect of yourself. So we used a whole bunch of these. Basically, we would give them to people until they just refused to take any more. We were really just trying to get our arms around this population. We were trying to get as much data as we possibly could, essentially, from this population. We then went to in-depth interviews, and we focused on these topic areas: cognition, affect, memory, and perception. And that was actually the key to the progress that we made, because it allowed us to slide underneath everybody's language, right? I didn't have to listen to you talking about, well, I was happy to, but I didn't have to listen to you talking about Jesus dwelling in your heart, right? Or a sense of spaciousness if you were Buddhist or whatever. I was able to say, well, tell me what's changed in your thinking, in your thoughts and your thinking. Are there more thoughts? Are there fewer thoughts? Do they grab you as much as they used to? Do they grab you more? Are they more important? Are they more emotionally charged? Are they less emotionally charged, right? So nuts and bolts things that everybody in here experiences, and everybody in here can answer very matter-of-factly. That never really had been asked to this population before. And even on the occasions when we had these famous teachers, they would kind of sit there and think, well, hold on, let me think about that. Right? You're talking about people who have had just hundreds or thousands of questions asked to them about this over time, and yet they've never had our questions asked to them. So this was a huge benefit for a couple of reasons. First of all, there was no way for you to know the right answer before you sat down with us, right? So you weren't going to really be able to fool us. It was across so many different cultures, 6 continents, well over 1,000 people. You basically either knew the right answer because that's what you were experiencing, or the right answer is just what other people that were in this population had experienced, or you didn't. So that was kind of a really, really key thing. And then we were always looking, the empiricist in me was always looking sort of for psychological claims that I could test with some sort of experiment. So we also did do some experiments on the population, and we did some measurement, but not much physiological measurement. I was looking for what was the same across the population. And so, if you could...
I'm sorry to interrupt this.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of important. I just wanted to know how you found the population. Were you giving this to a lot of other people first, or how did you find these people?
I hear you. Take this on faith for me today, if
Okay.
you would, because that's a long part and we only have so much
Okay.
time. But if you can go to nonsymbolic.org/publications and you can read all about that. I get that question all the time, but that's going to take up a chunk of time
I got you.
to explain. Okay, so when we think about, what for those of you in the back that can't see this, it says Gail arrives at the crux of the problem down here, right? And the problem is essentially it's me. And that very much defines what's going on with persistent non-symbolic experience. It's a fundamental shift in the way that you experience yourself. So you have a sense of self, and there's a fundamental way that changes for you. And it changes kind of from this highly individualized narrative form of sense of self, which most people in here are probably experiencing. And if not, those of you that aren't anymore probably remember when you did experience it, to something else, right? Which I'm just calling expanded today. That something else very much relates to your beliefs, your ideology, your enculturation, right? So if you're a Christian, for instance, it might relate to Christ or the Trinity or a feeling of the divine indwelling in you. If you're a Buddhist, it might show up as spaciousness. Again, if you go to that publications page, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about PNSE today. There's all kinds of videos of me talking about it, interviews and papers and stuff that you can read that flesh all this out for you. And you'll see that they're basically all interrelated. Underneath the hood, tremendously similar, but from that sort of layer on up, you're putting your own cultural and ideological and stuff biases and lenses, and you're sort of experiencing it through that. So another big change is degree of emotion. And this is kind of surprising how much this changes, I think. It starts off on the really far side, way over here, with literally no emotion. People report feeling no emotion if they go far enough into this. Take a step back from there and you basically have the classic unitive state for a religion like Christianity, where there's one dominant emotion. It feels like joy and love and compassion, and you're experiencing it all the time, and it's not really interrupted or punctuated. Come back from there and it is punctuated occasionally with some negative emotion that can mix in. Come back from there a little bit and you have a mix of positive and negative emotions. They arise and they fall off faster. So there's, again, you can go to that publications page and check out more details on this. But what I really want to highlight in this presentation is that these are very different ways of experiencing emotion, right? 3 very clearly different ways or categories of experiencing emotion. And yet they're all very much within the basket of persistent non-symbolic experience. So it turns out what we actually have are sort of these collections of different ways that you can experience this. Normally, we talk about these as locations because I don't like loaded terms like levels, right? So to me, location 1, 2, 3, and 4 form, as far as we can tell, the bulk of how people experience this. But you'll notice that there is an arrow. There is post-location 4 that an even tinier fraction of the population experiences. Since most people fall into these locations, they're essentially the ones that we stick with. So they cluster together. They represent regions, right? So something that's kind of cool about PNSE is that you can land anywhere, right? So you can go from normal waking consciousness, sort of normal individualized consciousness somewhere over here, and then you can jump right into location 3 and land somewhere in location 3. Or you can land somewhere in location 2. You don't have to go from here to here to here to here to here. You can also, once you land in a spot, either deepen in that spot. So when I say deepening in a spot, I mean maybe you land like right here in location 3, and maybe you move a little bit more towards location 4, but you don't actually cross into location 4. That's what I mean. And what that shows up as is your experience is colored a little bit more as a location 4 person than it was at location 3. So if you think about those emotional changes, right, at location 3, you've got that one dominant emotion of love and compassion and joy and that type of thing. Location 4, you have no emotion, right? So this is really a gradient. These are somewhat arbitrary buckets, but they're helpful from a discussion standpoint. I'm just going to ask people to sort of hold questions until the end, if you would, because I just want to make sure that we get everything in that we want to get in here. All right. So some people move, some people stay in one spot. Almost everyone deepens. But in terms of hopping locations, that's not actually that typical. So ordinarily what happens is that people land in a spot and they deepen in that spot, but they don't necessarily move to a different way of experiencing this, though some people do. And generally it's a forward progression, but not always. So there's some nuances in how that shows up. Another way to think about it is that there's a number of different dimensions that sort of show up around this. You have, your sense of self, your emotion, your thoughts, and the cognitive component as an example. So there's different ways to visualize this. Now, the thing that I mostly want to highlight from a PNSE standpoint for this talk is just all of these different changes, that there are changes, right? You can go and see all kinds of stuff on the website or another talk or whatever, where we really sort of dig into these different changes. But the important thing for hacking this stuff is that you're not basically looking for a button that takes you to one other spot, right? This isn't a shift into one specific place. There's lots of different ways that this experience shows up. Now, what's common across it all is a fundamental shift in self, away from that narrative individualized self towards that expansive self, if you will. So that's common across all of these different locations. But the nature of the experience itself is fundamentally different in each one of these locations. The perspective is different, etc. All right, so just some other interesting data. Again, you can't pick people out of a crowd. There's no way, probably, that you're going to pick people out. They still are pretty much normal. If they had hobbies and preferences, which everybody does, and they dress a certain way, and shrimp is their favorite food, or whatever, beforehand, that doesn't change. right? So essentially all of those things stay the same moving forward, which is kind of funny because inside it feels like you've had this totally different, this amazing change. But on the outside, people often don't even notice. You go to work, you think to yourself, oh my gosh, how in the world am I going to get through the day? There's been this totally different change in me. Everybody's going to notice. Will I even be able to sort of still do my job? And on the way home, you're driving home, and you're thinking to yourself, wow, well that day passed, and I was a little bit more effective than I was before. That was pretty cool. And why the heck didn't anybody notice that there was this enormous change inside of me? They also can be very dogmatic. It kind of depends on how you cross over. If you're a Christian and you cross over within the context of Christianity, maybe before you were thinking to yourself, hey, Christianity's great and I kind of believe in it, but there seems like there's all these other paths and they're really valid too. But then you go to church one day and boom, you have this experience and you cross over into PNSE. Pretty much from that point on, Christianity is the right path, right? I mean, you're convinced basically at that point. So there can be a degree of dogmatism that enters into this depending on how someone transitions into it. People still get divorced. I think that's a surprise. People view that there's this perception that people are going to be perfect, right? That must lead to perfect relationships and perfect whatever. But there's all sorts of reasons why people get divorced as a part of this. You really have to sort of escape a little bit of the spiritual salesmanship that's gone into these states and sort of ground yourself in the reality of them if you want to look through our research. The morality often doesn't change. Health behaviors, people still often smoke. For example, if they were using illegal drugs beforehand, they may very well still be using illegal drugs afterwards. So, there isn't some magical shift in morality that occurs as a result of this either. Again, your preferences, your morals, all of that basically just keeps going. This is kind of an interesting one. You can lose it, and it seems like aside from having some sort of brain damage or something, one thing that really can knock it out of people is extremely stressful experiences. Now, the funny thing about that is that if you ask them, they say to themselves, no, I'm not stressed at all, right? But if you then do an objective measure of them, they're not sleeping, they're basically their sexual patterns are off, their eating patterns are off. You can just kind of go down the list of things that relate to, objectively being able to look at stress. You can even measure them physiologically. The stress is showing up in them. So there's also a little bit of a disconnect that can go along with this. And as a result of that, people can in fact become so physiologically stressed out that it pulls them out of this experience, even if they've been in it for many, many years, and even if they would have sworn up to that moment that you can't possibly lose it. Which is a very common thing. People think, people are always arguing, you can't lose this no matter what, it's always there, right? Until they lose it, and then they're like, So how does it happen? Well, for a certain percentage of the population, they're actually trying. So, they're unhappy with whatever it is in their life, and they're seeing, they've read sort of the salesmanship around this, and they're thinking to themselves, all right, this is it. This is the thing that I need in order to get happy. And if it works for them, a very small percentage of people are able to really get there with the techniques that are out there and stuff. But if somehow they look out and it works for them, they were right, actually. It will have an amazing impact on them. There's another group of people in the bottom here. This caption says, in the morning, things just started to slip away from Corley. So there's another sort of group of people that get to this from some sort of self-objectifying event. I think maybe the best example of this is extreme depression. Suicidal depression. Can you imagine how much you have to objectify yourself to want to kill yourself? Right? I mean, that's a pretty intensely self-objectifying thing. So there are a very tiny percentage of people who, the razor blade is right at their wrist, and then bam, they cross over into this. So self-objectifying type events, that's just one example. And then there's a third category where, frankly, we just have absolutely no idea. People are just like working out in a field and it hits them, or there's, walking across the street and bing, and they have no frame of reference for what happened to them. All of a sudden their experience of the world is fundamentally different than everybody else's, which is what this is trying to show here in this cartoon. It says Troy can now see that he's out of the normal flow of things, right? And everybody's got funny hats in this case, and he still seems normal. It would be maybe the other way around. You don't really have anyone to talk to about this if this happens to you, right? I mean, it's not like there's 30% of the world that is experiencing this, so you just have 30% of your friends that are in this and can say, oh yeah, sure, I went through that, and here's what's going to happen next, and it'll settle in this way, and here's what I found helpful, to deal with that thing. That just doesn't really happen. What most, we're talking about 0.3 maybe to 0.5% of the population that experience this, so your odds of knowing someone else in a close way that experiences it, that's pretty rare. So people that just sort of have this happen out of the blue and have no frame of reference for it or no context to situate it in, they wind up at a psychotherapist's office. Because even though they're in tremendous well-being, it's such a totally different experience that they're concerned that they've had, some sort of adverse psychological event. Well, okay, let's get into the hacking part of this. So our entire project from the beginning has kind of been making this assumption, that it's all in the brain. So the entire way that we set up this project 8 years ago was to try to figure out if we could sort people for neurological scanning, fMRI, EEG, whatever. And then from that, identify some key regions of interest in the brain that we might be able to manipulate either with neurofeedback or neurostimulation. And if you think about it, what you're really asking is a very hard age-old question with that, which is, where is the I in the brain? It's not like we're the first people who thought about asking that, right? There's tons of people that are out there asking that within the academy. This is just one model from one person, a pretty famous guy named Antonio Damasio, where he's defined different types of self and the way, where they may show up in the brain and whatnot. There's a zillion of these models out there, basically. There's just lots of these models out there, and very rarely do they actually agree. Most of the work in the meditation space and the other spaces that relate in some way, we think, to PNSE. So you're talking about the mind-wandering research and stuff like that. Most of that stuff comes down to what's called the task and default network. And these are two different networks in the brain. This is kind of the classic image that you see everywhere. If you're on the academic side of the world, every time somebody talks about the task and default network, they show this slide, because this is one of the earliest representations of it. This is a brain cut in half. And down the middle of it, on the default network, there's a couple of major nodes. This is called the medial prefrontal cortex. It's in the front of the brain. This is called the posterior cingulate cortex. It's in the back of the brain. So you can see that these areas, they're not on the outside. This is the outside of the brain. That's the task network. This default network is on the inside of the brain. Well, the default network has been pretty well correlated to things like self-referential thinking and selfing itself at this point. If you think about it, it's pretty darn helpful that we've had that, right? Because it allows us to think about the future, allows us to reflect on mistakes we've made for the past, and essentially the story here is very simple in terms of where this picture comes from. Somebody thought to themselves, geez, I wonder what would happen if we looked at all the fMRI images while people were just laying there waiting for an experiment to begin, right? What's happening before, we're having them focus on this thing or actually, participate? What if we looked at a whole bunch of that? What's going on in the brain? Well, it turns out that what's going on in the brain is that this default network is hot. People are basically laying their mind wandering. They're thinking about, well, I hope this thing doesn't, explode while I'm in it. It's kind of loud. I mean, whatever they're thinking about, right? Their mind is just drifting. So that's that contemplation. And it's very useful, because if it turned out that that fMRI machine was dangerous, you would want to run away from that, right? So it's helpful to be able to analyze whether the experience that you're having right now is in some way dangerous. So you can see it's adaptive, why we'd want it. The task network is a little different. And these are two different names for these, the default network, the intrinsic network. It's the same network, but I thought, lots of times you're reading stuff out there in the popular press, so I would just put both words up there so that later you're not confused, or if you've heard of one or the other with different terms, you're not confused. So when you're tasking, I mean, what are you doing? You're doing stuff, right? The task network is actually well named because that's the network that's hot when you're doing something. I'm speaking right now. It's probably a given that my task network is pretty lit up, right? I'm not standing up here thinking about what I'm going to have for dinner. This is a new presentation. If I were giving my PNSE presentation that I've given 1,000 times, then I probably would be like daydreaming while I'm just going through the motions, right? But I'm not. I'm up here. I'm really trying to focus on this presentation. You're hopefully trying to focus on paying attention to me, right? So your task network is probably active, and it's probably switching between, what did he just say? Oh crap, did I miss something important? And oh, now I'm paying attention, you know, right? That's that task and default network switching back and forth, and it's got kind of a rhythm to it. And incidentally, that rhythm is what you see right here. These are anti-correlated networks in the brain. When one's up, one's down, basically. Okay, so coming back to PNSE research, this is from Judd Brewer's work. He was at Yale, now he's at UMass, but this was done when he was still at Yale Med. And essentially, his work suggests that there are two key areas to pay attention to in terms of changes that may occur with PNSE. And if you look at them, don't they look strikingly familiar? Right? Here's the medial prefrontal cortex, again, the front of the brain, right? And there's the PCC, basically, lit up in the back of the brain. So in this case, he's measuring, there were some awake people, there were some enlightened people, some PNSE people in his sample, there were long-term meditators. These are actually different types of meditation down here. We don't need the details of all of that. But if today you were to say to me, what should I build a device to impact? I would say one of these two regions, right? So out here in consciousness hacking land, the problem for you at this moment is where these are located. This is pretty deep in the brain, and that's pretty deep in the brain too, right? So there's other stuff in between, unless you're drilling a hole in your head, right, and shoving something down in there, which, you know, for the record, I don't recommend in any way. That's including you at home on video. Unless you're doing something kind of crazy like that, right, you've got to figure out some way to get it through the skull and through the rest of the brain, basically, that's in between you and that region, which is, you know, it's a little bit, you can see it sort of there, and there's a whole lot more of it there. And then it's sort of compounded, it's even harder because the skull's thicker in the back. So now you've got this thick skull part to contend with back there that's a little thinner up here at least. So it's actually a very hard technical problem to get at those two regions of the brain. But somebody's going to ask, hey, where should I point this thing, right? And if I were a tech and I were building stuff, I would point it at those two locations. And you can talk to me later if you want. There's all sorts of evidence for why we would point it there. And there's all kinds of some early experiments and stuff that have been done that are very promising. Now here's the flip side. This is very recent work, just came out this year, 2014, and it suggests that there's something going on at a brainstem level. So it's not just necessarily about neurofeedback or neurostimulation on those two areas. There's all sorts of areas in the brain, basically, that are implicated in changes associated with things like advanced meditation, PNSE. And even down into the brain stem. And if you look down here, you can kind of see, yeah, I can see, you know, you're talking about fundamental changes in mood and well-being and your sense of self and how you perceive the world. If you can read this list here from these deep brain regions, and I just put a couple of them up, it's true of the other ones as well that were detected in this research, you can kind of make sense of it. You're kind of like, oh, wow, yeah, that seems to relate. Here's the deal. Getting neurofeedback to work at a brainstem level, that's pretty hard. You want to talk about, I mean, you know, it was deep enough in the brain when it was here and here. Now imagine it being here, right? The other thing is, the brainstem is really dangerous to screw around with, right? It's where your heart rate is controlled. You know, you basically kill yourself by screwing around with stimulation stuff and whatnot involving the brainstem. So you have to be very, very careful, right? So although there are some things that it makes a lot of sense to use some techniques like neurostimulation and neurofeedback to try to get at There are other things that are implicated in this, like the brainstem, that you really don't want to go near, especially not outside of a major, university or some other hardcore research environment where you've got all kinds of experts or whatever. Okay, so just some other quick things to consider here. First of all, the brain's really flexible. It changes quickly. People are doing brain scans off of like a few weeks of students meditating. You know how it is in the academic world. Your subjects are also often the people that are taking like Psych 101 and they can't get out of that class until they volunteered a certain amount of their time. And so they wind up in studies like this, right? So there's sort of this bias in academic research towards the subjects being these young kids that are in school. 6 weeks, 3 weeks, 8 weeks, 2 weeks, 1 day even in some cases, of meditation produces change in the brain. Deepak Chopra has just publicly announced findings that show that you have a change in telomerase, basically, which is it's sort of it relates to DNA and it sort of relates to just to make it very simple, I guess we could say it relates to sort of changes at a DNA level, and that's happening during like a 30-minute meditation period. Right? It's probably happening right away at some point in that meditation, which is kind of a remarkable thing, right? So there's an enormous amount of change that's happening all the time in the brain. The brain is very, very flexible. It's very, very plastic. Again, there's many brain regions that are implicated in this. And so we probably need to think about a variety of techniques and methods. So let's get into that a little bit. Let's talk about some different ways that we can do some consciousness hacking. And here I'm going to broaden out. I'm not just going to make this about persistent non-symbolic experience, which is the thing that I'm most interested in. I'm going to make it also about sort of things to put into your minds, other ways that you can impact. Not just PNSE, but things that are even just kind of in the general direction of PNSE, meaning more psychological, in-the-mind well-being types of things. So they don't involve this huge shift to PNSE. This might just be lowering stress, lowering anxiety. So the techniques and the things that we'll talk about, they're all things that we can use from this perspective. Not just the perspective of PNSE. And I don't know if you guys can all see this or if you saw this article, but it says, shocking but true, students prefer jolt of pain to being made to sit and think. Did you see that article that came out in like the last week or two? I'm trying to be topical here, in the news. No kidding, like something like 65% of, I think, male students it was, and 25% of female students or something in the sample. So more men than women want to shock themselves to get out of thinking, which is kind of interesting to begin with. But beyond that, I mean, can you imagine that like you're given the choice between just sitting and thinking or shocking yourself in a painful way? And you're like, well, I'm going to take the shock. And that was actually what happened, which is kind of astonishing, right? That's how much we want to avoid living in the default network, right? That's how sort of programmed we are over to switch to that task network. Even when the task is physically painful to us, we're still like, I'll take the pain. All right, so let's talk about some tech approaches to this. First of all, feedback. So there's different types of feedback that we can have. We can have neurofeedback, and we're going to talk a little bit more about each one of these. I'm just going to kind of give you a survey of these. So we can have neurofeedback, and we can have other forms of biological feedback. I feel like we were incredibly fortunate today to have the speaker just before me, right, talking about a breath rate sensor, because that's an awesome example of a technology that is not neurological based. It doesn't need my brain scans and all this other stuff that I just showed you, right? There's so many other, as we'll see in a minute, interfaces. There's different types of stimulation right now, really mostly focused on neurostimulation. And then there's traditional tools, It's things like meditation that can be augmented or redesigned in some way with technology. And of course, if you've searched any of the app stores, you've seen a zillion different meditation apps, just as an example, or tons of different relaxation apps or stress-related apps or whatever. So let's talk first of all about the types of feedback. This is one of Mikey and I's favorite conversations, this types of feedback stuff. First of all, biased and unbiased. Biased means you know the destination, right? So I want reduced stress. I want to relax, and I want to relax right now. I'm going to put some sort of biased feedback on my head, some sort of tool that leads me down the path to relaxation. That's biased feedback. Unbiased feedback is totally different than that. You're getting feedback, you're getting biological-based feedback, but it's not designed to take you in a specific direction. So this is a good example of this is Mikey's project, this project that we're working on at BioFluent, which is an idea where you provide people audio-based feedback for some sort of biosensing data. That could be heart rate variability stuff, it could be brainwave stuff, but it's always there. You're listening to that audio, and what you're really doing is you're either listening to your HRV or something about your heart rate signal, or you're listening to your brainwaves, and over time, in the background, you're kind of learning more accurately how to navigate those different spaces. You're learning kind of in the background, not even consciously, as you go along, how to improve from an HRV standpoint or from a brainwave standpoint. So that's unbiased feedback. And then it can be part-time or full-time, right? You can wear your Spire sometimes, you can not wear your Spire sometimes, to talk about the earlier person's talk, or it can be full-time, right? So it could be also full-time, real-time, or full-time recording, but something that you look at on a chart later, or it can be both, right? The Spire was a really great example of that, because you basically have full-time, real-time breath monitoring. You could look, and the application was fogging up and all that other stuff that it was doing that was super cool. I mean, some awesome design stuff in there. But you could also later go ahead and take a look at charts and graphs and maybe plot stuff out and whatever other interface they're giving us to that data. And then there's different ways to provide that feedback. So BioFluent is focused a lot on the auditory path right now. We think it's pretty easy to have earbuds in people's ears, and it's not that intrusive. They don't have to be wearing a VR headset, or they don't need Google Glass or something else like that that could provide really real-time, full-time visual feedback. So there's visual, auditory, touch, and vibration is another one. Your touch sensations in your body, they're so incredibly nuanced. They're much, much more sensitive even than your hearing is. And so you can provide a much greater degree sort of subconscious or subliminal or sort of background feedback using that somatosensory system, that touch system, than you could with any of these other options. So as you're thinking about tech, and as you're thinking about consciousness hacking type tech, these are some, I think, of the major categories that you're dealing with from a feedback standpoint. As I said, right from the beginning, I've had this slide for, I don't know, probably close to 8 years at this point. And you can see this was our research arc. Try to get people collected and sorted down here so that we could do the neuroscanning stuff with them and verify that the areas that we found were able to be fed back. And then maybe some narrow AI to catch some of the stuff that you missed with other statistical analysis type tools, right? And then eventually working towards home type systems. Okay, so on the neurofeedback front, there's really only one of these that's very practical at a home level, and that's EEG. If you think about fMRI or MEG, and the RT just stands for real-time, like real-time feedback fMRI. If you think about RT fMRI or fMRI or MEG, which is a magnetic imaging technique, essentially, these are things that cost millions of dollars. They're super, super hard to do if you don't know what you're doing. And so they're not techniques that you're likely to have in your house anytime soon, right? They're the techniques that the other stuff is kind of built on. EEG is the thing that you're seeing roll out right now, right? We've got open source EEG projects that are out there in a couple of major directions. And I know that there are people in the room, there are some people in the room that are very involved with a couple of those projects. So EEG is kind of low-hanging fruit. So something like, it's not hard to see something like an open BCI type system being able to be scaled up and used in such a way that it would be really, really useful for feedback in terms of a consciousness hacking type of approach. Incidentally, this is fMRI. It can also do sort of the tracks in the brain, the connections in the brain. That's what EEG looks like when you're going crazy with it, with a whole ton of different sensors. Obviously, people wouldn't walk around with like 200 sensors on their head, right? We try to get those down. And incidentally, I think the lowest that they're down to right now is Judd Brewer's group has, I think, around 30 electrodes that can get at the PCC. And that's down from, over 100 electrodes just a couple of years ago. So things are heading essentially in that direction. So this is one way that EEG can show up that you can also project on our brain. This is actually an MEG thing, but fMRI or EEG can also sort of be represented that way. That's an MEG machine. So that's what I'm saying. You're probably not going to put that in your garage or something anytime soon. Right? This is Adam Ghazali's work, kind of bringing everything together. He's at UCSF, and he's into video games and visualizing the brain in complicated ways. And he's really working with a lot of super awesome people. So you can see in here there's a scan, right, of someone's brain with MRI. And then they did the track work. You can see the tracks in here. The thing about MRI is that it's pretty slow. You can't see real-time, rapid signal changes like you can with another technology like EEG, for instance. And so what he's doing in this visualization is he's really combining together a number of different technologies to provide a representation. And he's able to, he calls this the Glass Brain Project, if you want to look it up. It's an awesome project, and he's a super cool guy. And you can see that you can actually fly into the brain. So as you're thinking about neurofeedback projects, right, you don't have to think about them in the way you've maybe thought about them in the past up to this point, which is, make the balloon go up, or, make the bar on the screen go higher, or make the screen brighter if you're watching a movie, or all of these other types of very simple feedback things that have been used to this point. This is the type of thing that it's headed towards. It's headed towards these sort of very rich, powerful displays. I mean, imagine being able, while you're in a feedback environment, and you can in his lab actually right now, while you're in a feedback environment, being able to fly right into your own brain and literally see how the connections are being made and how the information is flowing and all of that. It's coming to that point. And so, as we look out in the coming years, there's going to be some really, really powerful changes here. Okay, so that's neurofeedback. What about biofeedback? There's all kinds of different biofeedback that are low-hanging fruit that you can get at. And I thought it might just be fun to give you a little list of all of the different things that you can track. There's all kinds of cheap, very hackable, very easy to do and create ways to get at this data. Pupil dilation, facial muscles, eye blink strength, eye tracking, galvanic skin response, heart rate. There's all sorts of stuff that you can do with heart rate. You hear about heart rate variability, but there's also like decline in heart rate that can tell you some things. I mean, heart rate is really one of those rich areas. You heard about breath, so we don't need to talk too much more about that. That was a great presentation earlier. Temperature sensing. I mean, these are all things that provide you with the ability to really sense things about people's consciousness and to provide a direct means of feedback that's very, very, very meaningful for different ways. And I don't just mean stress and well-being, but lots of different things. You can do attentional-based things, learning-based things, memory-based things, you name it. There's so many different things that can be done. And these technologies are, most of them, super cheap to deal with. They're very, very easy to implement. So it's great for a consciousness hacking type of crowd, like this. Now you can also get more esoteric, and you can do things like measure blood gases, right? You can measure hormones and neurotransmitters. You can do some real-time measurement, basically, of blood as it's flowing through the veins or before and after, things like that, right? So that's a little bit more esoteric. I think that's a little bit harder from just a do-it-yourself, hack in your own garage kind of direction. But certainly that's possible. And if you think about a community like the one that's being built here, where you've got scientists coming together with people that have really no science background but are maybe engineers, or maybe even just self-learned science and engineering. And the groups that we've already seen forming in this space, they're so incredibly powerful. And there's so many different types of expertise that they allow you to really dig deeply into these. And even I know of people that are working in these areas that are just kind of hacking stuff together, which is incredible if you think about it. Okay, so the other one is stimulation. It's one thing to be reading some sort of signals off of the body and then providing some sort of feedback. It's another thing to actually ask yourself, well, what about direct brain stimulation? Hey, if we know that there's this area in the PCC in the back between the hemispheres, or the medial prefrontal between the hemispheres and the front of the head, should we be, just directly targeting that? And what can we target that with, stimulation-wise? The math is really, really hard to get at those places. 30 sensors, right? And some math from like Yale scale physicists and stuff to get at the PCC, right? Between the hemispheres and the back of the brain. That's hard neurofeedback action to do. But what about stimulation? Is stimulation easier? Can we just kind of reach in there and say, well, let's upregulate, this millimeter of brain. Let's downregulate this millimeter of brain. Let's scramble the signals in this millimeter of brain. How plausible is that? And it's actually becoming very, very, very plausible. So what I want to talk about are these technologies here. The first one is TMS, which is basically, it's called transcranial magnetic stimulation. And it's really good at triggering things. So you've maybe seen on TV where someone has this giant sort of plastic figure 8 looking thing on their head, and somebody pushes a button and the person's hand twitches or something like that, right? So it's able to directly stimulate the brain, in that case, in parts of the motor cortex. That's not something that people are probably going to build and play around with at home. And even if you do build it, manage to build it and play around with it at home, it's probably not something that you're going to find that useful compared to what you can do with some of these other technologies. So let's look at those. The first one, and I think the lowest hanging fruit by far, I don't know, did you get my message about it? So as Mikey said, he came, I was in Hong Kong, and Mikey came and lived with me actually for about 7 months. Fortunately, we had a huge house. It wasn't like your normal tiny apartment in Hong Kong. We had a giant house, so he had his own floor and everything. He had the best view, actually. And he built this device. This is a TDCS device. This is our first TDCS device. To show you how insane I am, I was the first one to put that on my head. So we literally went to the market, one of the open-air electronic markets in Hong Kong, and brought an analog multimeter, and a 9-volt battery and some wire, and some metal plates. And we came back, and Mikey basically soldered this thing up, tucked it all neatly inside the case, as a media lab guy would do. And then he hands me the electrodes, and I strap them on my head, and we turn it on. I've been like this ever since. So the fascinating thing about that is that what it provoked in me, what that first session provoked in me, was a mystical experience, which is kind of incredible if you think about it. Now, this TDCS technology, it's not like TMS. It doesn't cause neurons to fire. What it does is basically make a neuron more or less likely to fire, right? So if you look at the direction of current from the positive pole to the negative pole, right, this area of cortex would be more likely to fire. This area would be less likely to fire. That's the general idea. Now, in reality, it's very imprecise. So a lot of current is shunted over the skin. A lot of current is kind of going everywhere in the brain. The modeling on this kind of stuff is amazingly complicated. But you can find it out there. There's a guy named Mariam Mixon who does the modeling on this type of stuff. And it's really kind of incredible to see this stuff just kind of flowing all over the brain. But in general, you do get, a greater likelihood of activation here and a greater likelihood of deactivation there. And it comes down to you doing something with that, right? So all you're really doing is priming the brain to be more or less likely to fire in certain areas. And whether or not there's any firing, you just put this thing on your head and you just kind of sit there. you can't really expect that much. It turns out that what we think produced the mystical experience, and when we first tried this thing, when I strapped it on my head, is that I was, it was literally an experimental setup. I was a research assistant, the camera is recording it, Mikey's taking notes, another research assistant's taking notes. And I'm just meticulously describing my moment-to-moment experience of this, right? Which is a whole lot like some forms of meditation that I've practiced in the past. And what we eventually learned was that with a certain montage and certain types of meditation, you can get that type of effect, right? Other people, the next person basically that put it on, just kind of put it on and sat there and didn't do much description, and really nothing happened for them. We were sort of like, well, that's weird. I'm not more predisposed, I feel like, to mystical experiences than other people are, so what's going on? And that's what was going on. It's just kind of how you use it. Okay, so here's the digital version of Mikey's design, right? You can see how incredibly easy this thing is to build, right? I mean, it's a battery, for crying out loud. You're basically talking about 1 to 2 milliamps. You definitely want to use a battery. You don't want to plug it into the wall. You don't want to put it in, you don't want to, for the camera, you don't want to have a situation where something might go wrong in the circuit that you've built and all of a sudden you're cooking someone's brain. So there's another variation of this, and it's the AC version, not the DC version. So TACS is the AC version of this. And the cool thing about it is that it doesn't really just sort of condition the brain to be more or less likely to fire in different regions. It can actually be used to tune the brain. And so what you see up here is kind of an example of some neurons that are all kind of going in different directions. Maybe you have different brain waves being represented here. So maybe you've got some beta and some alpha and some theta or something. And there's just all sorts of stuff going on. And then you throw on a TACS unit and use a certain signal, and you get them all kind of locked onto alpha, as an example. Now, it's an oversimplification, but that's the type of thing that is essentially possible with this technology. And here's a good example of how you can use that. You can use that in sort of an in-phase and out-of-phase way to either amplify an existing signal or to downregulate a specific brainwave frequency, say, in the brain. Here's an example involving the motor cortex with someone that had tremors, physical tremors. I want to say this is a Parkinson's study, I believe. But you can look up the reference down here. These slides are all referenced. It's the academic in me. So, in this case, there's some measurement going on, right? And the stimulation is being put out of phase and being fed back in. And there's a reduction, basically, in the muscular activity that's being measured. There's a reduction in the tremor, which is a really sort of powerful medical physiological example. But we're consciousness actors here, right? So you can also think about the fact that this is a technology that really allows you to directly induce specific brainwaves in someone, to heighten them, to reduce them, to do that in specific parts of the brain. I mean, generally speaking, sort of with the same caveat that you have with TDCS on the previous page. It's not that you can get it down to some 1 millimeter of cortex or something, but that's a really, really powerful thing. Some of you have probably used headphones and listened to binaural beats that were trying to do this type of thing. This is kind of the next generation of that type of idea, if you will. Another one is transcranial ultrasound. This is really where everything is heading in terms of precise brain stimulation. It's all, I think, in later years here, going to be about ultrasound. Ultrasound can get you down to that millimeter level of resolution. It's extremely, extremely precise. And it can affect very precise areas of cortex deep in the brain without affecting the tissue going in and out. Which, there are some other things that can reach deep in there, some of them that we've talked about, but there's also a deep version, for instance, of TMS. There's a deep version of transcranial magnetic stimulation that can reach deeper into the brain. The problem is that it kind of hits everything on the way in. And that's not very helpful, right, from a precision standpoint. So if you think about that ACC and that PCC, right, you're hitting a whole ton of stuff before you get to that medial prefrontal cortex or that posterior cingulate cortex. Okay, so this shows you sort of some of the sweet spots where you can get a signal in without much interference from the skull. That's sort of interesting. This is a friend of ours, Stuart Hameroff. He's at the University of Arizona. He's an anesthesiologist, also one of the leading consciousness theorists in the world. He runs a conference called Towards the Science of Consciousness, which if you're interested in consciousness, you should absolutely check out. It's every other year, basically, in Tucson. And on off years, it's somewhere else in the world. I can't remember off the top of my head where the next one is. So this is Stuart with just a medical-grade ultrasound thing that, for some strange reason, he allowed people to put to his head. Now, in reality, this is kind of an interesting thing. It turns out that there's an IRB that previously existed in Arizona for doing this kind of thing. In other places, for instance, at Harvard, there's these really difficult, stringent IRBs to mess around with ultrasound. But ultrasound was evidently used for brain imaging before a lot of the other technologies that we're using today. And some universities still have them built into their IRB systems, where they just pencil whip the thing right on through. And Stu, it just so happened, wound up being lucky. He was at one of those things, right? So he didn't have to, he was all ready to fight and jump through hoops and whatever else. And they were like, oh, sure, go put it on your head. So that's a picture of him putting it on his head. We have someone in the audience, and I don't know, where is Sterling?
Yeah.
So Sterling, go ahead and stand up. Right. I want to give a shout out to Sterling Cooley, who is actually building a transcranial ultrasound device. And we talk about this stuff being hacked right now. Okay. Just so you know who to talk to about this later. When we talk about this stuff being built right now, it's really literally being built by people in rooms like this, in this case, in this room. Right? So he's modifying an existing ultrasound system, and he's got a clever array system to focus it to different depths. And this is literally just like a hack-together type of project. It's the kind of thing that we talk about. We talk about consciousness hacking. And before you think to yourself, oh my God, that sounds terrifying. There's a guy in the audience who's like built one of those things, and I'm never going to put that on my head. This guy, right, who's equally brave, this guy came and spoke at Berkeley not long ago at the Cognitive Technology Group. Stephen, you want to stand up so people know who you are? So at Berkeley, Stephen runs this amazing group where they get together and hack on this stuff. And Sterling and Stu was here not long ago. He's off for the summer or whatever, driving around in his motorcycle. And so he stopped by and he gave a talk at Berkeley. And he was impressed enough with Sterling's device that he wants to use it in future studies, right? So to him, this hacked-together device was valid enough for him to want to use it prospectively moving forward in studies. That's the kind of stuff that you can just do, right? It's out there to be done, and it's being done right now at places like Berkeley and at places, like the people in this room. Focused ultrasound is another example. The idea behind focused ultrasound is that it's essentially more precise. So this is actually a guy at Harvard named Shin-Suk Yu, and he's at Brigham Women's Hospital, if you want to look him up. And he's, I think, one of the most advanced ultrasound people out there. He's actually got a single transducer, which means just sort of one thing goes on your head, just like you saw with Stuart, but extremely precise system for focusing this. Lots of times the focus stuff that you see is actually a triangulation. So you would have more than one transducer on your head, and it would be where those basically they're audio waves, where those acoustical waves cross and have interference happen. But advancements are being made at this point. This is a pretty sophisticated setup that he's got. Advancements are being made at this point that you don't even need multiple transducers. You can just do it with a single transducer. I think this level of sophistication is kind of hard to hack your way into at this point. I mean, Shin-Suk's an incredibly brilliant researcher. He's done a lot of stuff in the neuroscience field. He's an incredible math whiz, the whole bit, right? So this type of stuff isn't necessarily to the place where you can hack away on it in sort of a small group like this, but this one certainly is, right? And if you go back to Stuart's study and you look up, his 2012 study, you'll find that there's all kinds of effects that you can see. This study specifically dealt with increasing mood. So in other words, people were in a better mood from this. Again, consciousness hacking. Very simple, right? A mood-enhancing thing. You go home at the end of the day, you stick this on your head for however long is recommended by the device manufacturer, and you let the day's stress melt away, right? That's basically the idea. Okay, so there's also traditional tools. So traditional tools might be meditation, it might be some cognitive science interventions, some psychological-based interventions. It might be things like prayer, which are often very similar to meditation. And I think it's important, remember back to the brainstem thing? Not everything can be hit with stimulation and feedback. Well, it can be. It's not everything that you want to have be hit by stimulation and feedback, right? So there's other things that have sort of this holistic effect, and there's a lot of documented effect and impact that they've had. The question, I think, from a technology standpoint is how do you enhance that? What can you make in terms of just sort of apps that don't necessarily have anything wired to your head, that aren't stimulating your brain in any way, that aren't reading biosignals off of your skin, that aren't doing anything like that? What other things can you do? These are the apps that are flooding the App Store and stuff right now. There's all sorts of ways, I think, personally, to make these a lot more effective for people. There's a whole lot of social stuff that hasn't been done. There's a whole lot of gamification stuff. If you're a serious app developer, you probably look at those meditation apps that are out there right now and think to yourself, my God, I could have done this in kindergarten. These are not so great. They're very few and far between for the good ones right now. But there's all kinds of powerful stuff that can be implemented. Before you think to yourself, well, that stuff sounds pretty squishy, that doesn't sound like nearly as powerful as strapping a transducer on my head and pushing the go button, right? Let me tell you about the experiment that Sperry, I mentioned earlier, participated in as one of the teachers earlier this year. So in February, we decided to look at our data, our 8 years, over 1,000 people, 6 continents, huge sample of data from persistent non-symbolic experience people. And we decided to put together the best practices. We looked in the data and we basically said, what's the stuff that seems to induce PNSE more than everything else? And we created a program. It was a 4-month program. You basically had to give us an hour and a half to 2 hours a day of your life. It was all delivered over video, live video, and stuff like that, right? There were a small number of participants, 3 men and 3 women, because I had to make sure that if they went crazy, we could psychologically support them. The reality is, nobody had ever done this kind of thing before. Nobody had ever asked them, nobody ever had a data set that said, what's the most powerful stuff? And then nobody had ever made everybody do it, right? So I had no idea, basically, what the impact of that was going to be. I was crossing my fingers that it would be positive, but I wasn't going to take 100 people in and have them all go nuts and have to find some way to support them. So I decided, well, realistically, if they all go crazy, we can probably support 6 of them at one time. And we have high, basically a couple that were high, a couple that were medium, and a couple that were low well-being. One of them was in South Africa. I wanted to test somebody far away. Unfortunately, that didn't work out very well because Google Hangouts just gave him some problems. So 5 of the people successfully completed it, and all 5 of them, much to my extreme shock, all 5 of them basically transitioned to non-symbolic experience. Now, I'm not calling it persistent non-symbolic experience because the academic definition for that is that you've experienced it for 1 year, right? So far, for these people, it's persistent, right? But our term, as we define it for academic purposes, you have to be persistent for a solid year at a minimum before we call it persistent non-symbolic experience. So everybody, you can see the different locations that people landed in. We were trying to tune it towards a sweet spot of sort of the end of location 2. That's actually a typo. That person is more in location 4. And one of these people has since transitioned from location 2 to location 3. So we gave them all kinds of measures, stress measures and well-being measures and depression measures and stuff like that. And they all moved very nicely along those measures. We had 3 sampling periods, 1 before, 1 halfway, 1 at the end of the class. They were all basically right in the right direction. So even people that started off at the worst, lowest point in their life wound up not only, incredibly happy and all that, but basically wound up on on the continuum. If you want to think about it in the vernacular, they basically wound up what we would traditionally consider enlightenment. So all I want to say there is, if you think that those subjective things don't work or don't have a certain power, that's an experiment that we just did that suggests that they have an enormous amount of power. And now the question is, sitting out in this group, right, sitting in a technology, consciousness hacking oriented group, what tools can be built based on that type of program that make that faster and more reliable? How do you get it down from 15 weeks to a few weeks? It's got to be possible. If you can do it in 15 weeks, for God's sakes, you must be able to do it faster than that, right? There's got to be better ways to deliver that than over Google Hangouts on Saturdays, right? So there's all sorts of advancements, I feel like, that can be made in the non-feedback, non-stimulation, one might say non-sexier forms of this technology that are applicable right now and can make impacts right now that we don't have to wait on. Okay, so I want to propose a couple of different things. First of all, for anybody that's you know, Mikey and I are always having people from the group. Mikey deals with the group a lot more than I do. I'm sort of more of the background advisor type. But people all the time are saying, what can we do? Give us something to hack on, right? Give us something to work on. So what I'd like to propose tonight is for anybody that's interested in this direction, this PNSE direction, that we think about forming a special interest group, essentially around that. And I would say just email Mikey or talk on the group or however you want to be communicated with. And we'll put that together. We have some other lists, some other technologists around the world, high-end technologists and stuff that we've collected together. This is just one of our initiatives basically in this space. And we're going to be doing that same thing. We're going to be basically extending that interest group out around the world with some leading technologists that are in this area and that are interested in this area. So that's the first thing that I would propose. You know, if you're interested in cognitive technologies, right? If you're interested in sort of well-being or shifts in a positive direction, let's figure out who's interested in that and let's get together and start talking about it. And let's see what can be done. Let's see what, you know, Sterling's got tech out there. It's all sorts of tech. There's tech in the Berkeley group that's out there that's being worked on. There's just all sorts of stuff that's going on. Let's try to sort of bring those efforts together, see what's going on. The other thing that we want to do is propose a community project. So again, people are sort of constantly saying, what is it that I can actually do? These talks are great, but what can we actually do? What's the lowest, you know, what can we do that we can just put on our head and get some sort of immediate benefit from? If you think about it, it's probably not a surprise to you that that's TDCS. The lowest hanging fruit is really some sort of device that's a TDCS, TACS, really sort of TXCS or T-star CS type of device, some sort of brain stimulation device. And if you ask yourself, well, okay, but what can you really do? What's actually in the academic literature around that kind of stuff? I mean, am I really going to put that on my head and notice some immediate effect from it? This is just some of the stuff last night while I was preparing the final part of this presentation that I yanked out of academic stuff, right? So learning effects, all kinds of learning effects, all kinds of memory effects, language fluency, mood and happiness. You know that there's my personal experience. This one isn't written up, but mystical experience, I thought I'd toss it in there anyway. Visual tracking, higher level cognitive functions, which make people happier and also make things just sort of flow better in terms of decisions and planning and things like that. Even reading improvements. I mean, we could just keep going with this list. I just picked some stuff in a way that I just kind of almost at random from some of the other stuff that's out there, but things that I thought would really drive home the point to anyone that was sitting out here in the audience that said, oh, okay, well, at least that one's interesting to me. Right? There should be something on this list that you want if you're sitting in this audience, right? Probably more than one thing. And then if you think about what does that academic literature show in terms of actual medical effects, and you know, it's used hugely for strokes, Parkinson's, schizophrenia, depression. There's all sorts of things that it's out there being used for in a very real way. When you look at these brain stimulation labs, they're basically located in research hospitals most of the time, right? So the major ones at Harvard, which is the ones that I'm more familiar with, they're located in teaching hospitals within Harvard because they're being applied on patients. You know, they're being used on stroke patients and things like that. These are not sort of imaginary effects or things that might have an impact. These are things that are being used every day. The military is using some of these things, for instance, to improve learning. There's a great study with Marines that basically taught them how to shoot faster and stuff like that. So there's all sorts of practical, real-world ways that this type of technology is being used. This is just the TDCS side of the fence. This isn't even the TACS side of the fence, which, remember, can enhance and inhibit specific brainwaves and brainwave patterns and things like that. So the same device essentially can do both. And that's quite powerful. So here's what we're kind of thinking of for a community project. Some sort of open TDCS, TACS hardware development. So we need to build a hardware device for this. Some sort of good digital hardware design for this. There's no good digital hardware design for this. That multimeter that we got from the, from the open air markets in Hong Kong, example of a non-digital version of this technology, right? So we're looking to sort of take that to another level. So we're trying to also think of a project that would involve different types of people in the group, right? So we have some hardware stuff for the hardware lovers out there. We've got some software development stuff, of course, that goes along with that. But also, we really like the idea of eventually having all of this stuff moving to a cloud. We see that there's the opportunity to have, and this is also being worked on by the Berkeley group and others, some interfaces with some of the various neuro type of stuff, like the OpenBCI things, and the OpenEEG type of things that are going on out there. So, being able to interface through to a web, to maybe have a web-based interface for all of this, to have that web-based data collection, to have a cloud out there that tons of data is being collected from lots of different people for really the first time in history that can be very powerfully analyzed in new ways. So it's kind of a citizen science association with this as well. It's kind of a citizen science, a self sort of improvement version of this. There's all sorts of stuff going on here. So this involves front-end and back-end web developers, people that understand the cloud. And I personally know that all of this stuff is in this room. I know enough of you in this room to know that every skill set we need is sitting right now in this room to do this project, which is pretty remarkable. And this isn't the only room it's sitting in, of course. It's also sitting in other related interest groups that are out there. So just a quick proposal there. Mikey will probably talk when I'm done about how to contact us on that and all of that. And that's it.